let's start with stars on screen, just to warm us up and see how much of a challenge letting go of guilt is to do with work for each of us. So would you say you feel guilty at work daily, weekly, sort of occasionally? You're like, yeah, it does happen along the way. Or are you in the sort of the never or kind of not really? You're like, oh, I'm interested in this topic, but this is not really for me. Doesn't really feel like top of my list of things to kind of worry about. Let me just, there we go. I'll make it anonymous. I know we're all a supportive community here, but I always think it's a bit easier when it's anonymous. If you're using the stars for the first time, you're looking for something that says few options, annotate, stamp, and then star. And don't worry if you can't use the stars. If you're on your phone, if you're out and about, you can always just put your observations into chat instead. Oh, that was me drawing that by accident. Sorry. Trying to move my chat. 1 sec. What are we doing? Thank you, everybody, for putting those on there. Right, here we go. Now I can move the chat. So let's see. Okay, so quite a few people saying weekly. Most of us are saying more kind of occasional. So it's perhaps not, it's not top of our list, which is good. I don't know if you have listened to the podcast yet this week. It is interesting when you start to read about guilt, how of all the emotions that we have, you get to ultimately every emotion is useful in some way, but it's one of the ones where no worries, someone just saying weekly, don't worry, I'll put the star on for you. It is one of those emotions where it can feel quite frustrating, but often sort of low-lying. You know, other emotions are sort of almost, they're more dramatic. So if you're angry or if you're sad, you know, those things often kind of feel more heightened. The emotions are often quite heightened. Whereas one of the things that's interesting about guilt is we sort of feel it and get used to it. So we're like, oh, it's like a low level frustration. So maybe therefore you don't end up doing anything about it because you're like, I've just sort of got used to feeling this way. And what's interesting about that, if that's how you feel, if you're like, yeah, it's just sort of part of my week, or it just sort of comes up, but I just sort of let it go. I just sort of live with it, essentially, is that then, you know, nothing changes. You're not sort of motivated to take action. And often you feel quite helpless. And when we feel helpless, it's really unhelpful. Because when we're helpless, we're like, well, we almost sort of disown control. So we're like, well, we're used to it. We sort of live with it. So there's nothing we can do. And we get to helplessness rather than helpfulness. So it's just interesting to think about kind of your relationship with guilt. And I do remember when I did talk to Dr. Bill Mitchell, I really do like his podcast episode. I refer back to it a lot. I was quite surprised when he said, like, this is the number one problem when we talk about resilience. And he does lots of one-to-one work with people on resilience and lots of work with teams on resilience. He was like, if you are feeling guilty, it really gets in the way of you being resilient, of investing in your resilience reserves. So, you know, maybe this is a really big challenge for you. Maybe it's a bit less of a challenge for you. But for all of us, I think it's something to think about. Never thought about it as guilt. Yeah, just assumed it was panic and anxiety of not being on top of things. Yeah, Sam, that's a really good observation. It can be quite subtle. Yeah, we're going to talk about productivity or lack of that can lead to guilt. Yeah, and how it snowballs. That's interesting. Yeah, does one thing kind of snowball to another? Really, really good insights there. Caroline, if you change the question, yeah, how often did you feel guilty at home? We're going to talk about that sort of, I guess, blurred boundaries, because usually one does link to the other. You're like, okay, I'll feel guilty at home all the time, maybe because I'm not there enough, or I'm not maybe showing up in the way that I want to show up. Maybe you're just thinking about work when you feel like, oh, I should be thinking about, I don't know, what my kid needs for tea or whatever. I should be concentrating on Bluey more than I am thinking, what email have I not sent? That's just a personal example there. So let's delete those ones here. So let me know now, thinking about work and home, so any part of your life, let's do a when question. When do you feel guilty? So what do those examples, the specific examples, how does guilt sort of show up for you? Because I think when you ask a when question, you start to figure out, what does this mean to me? How does this feel relevant in my experiences? When is it most likely to show up? So somebody already saying around, my when is definitely more at home. So that's useful. We've already started to be more specific, but you might go even deeper. So like, when specifically at home? Is it when you don't get work finished? Is it when you feel like you're not working enough? Yeah, Lucy, great one. When you feel like you've let someone down. Yeah. That's a really good one from Sam there around yeah, I really like that one. When you need to rest, but there's things that keep doing. Funnily enough, I'm really messy, which sometimes people are surprised by, but I am really messy. So I have like zero guilt about jobs. Like, it just doesn't bother me. And my partner is very tidy. And I think he's just like, I don't get it. I don't get how you can look at that pile of clothes and not almost like feel guilty or feel it's like, meh, it's fine. So that's not my challenge. Just challenging to live with, maybe. When you miss your kid's appointment, when you can't motivate yourself. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I don't think I've seen that insight yet. That's a really good one. You almost feel guilty for not feeling up for it, not feeling motivated. I really recognize that one. I don't think you would be alone there. If you've wasted someone's time. Yeah, so there's a time one, because we're like, oh, we're kind of maybe sometimes guilty about wasting someone's time stops us in the first place. You know, it might stop us having curious career conversation, because we're like, oh, I don't want to waste their time and I feel guilty about that. So maybe it sort of stops us taking action. Julia, yeah, comparison, kind of a classic one, I think, because you compare yourself to someone who, let's say in our team in Amazing If, people will work quite differently. And so actually, if you compare yourself to other people in our team, it always be incredibly unhelpful, because like, well, everyone works different hours, different times. So you always feel like you'd be like, oh, I'm not working as much as that person, versus actually everyone just works differently. So a really easy trap to fall into, I think. Juggling lots of things. Yeah, Caroline, that point of I'm doing a bit of everything, but am I actually doing anything well? Yeah, Hannah, taking time for yourself. I think some people find that really difficult. You know, the do one thing for you every day, which was one of the 10 career quick wins, you know, the kind of the active rest thing. I think some people just they always put other people before themselves, like really consistently. I always think that makes you a really lovely person, and usually a very empathetic person. But it's just important to know kind of that's what you also need to do some things for you too. You don't want to burden your colleagues when it's out of your control. Yeah, Susie, interesting when you're quieter. Yeah, you're like, oh, I feel guilty. I'm not full on when something goes wrong, not achieved enough. Yeah. Oh, Sam, you're going to pay me lots of money for that. Like, I think it's just a personality deficit thing, to be honest. You know, when you're like, I don't think I taught myself. It just doesn't. I think, do you know what it is? I'm just not motivated by it. I'm very motivated by the work that I do, and I'm very motivated for being there for some moments with my family. So I have a kind of very clear boundaries around when I show up and when I don't. Just not motivated by the job thing. So it just doesn't make me feel guilty. Heather, you're the same as me. I talked about this in the podcast this week. When you're not well, I'll put it in brackets because we're not well. When you're not well, that's when I feel really guilty. When you take time off, even when you're on holiday, yeah. Overloading your director, yeah. So that's like maybe putting things on other people. When your priorities are not somebody else's. Wanting to leave a job, yeah, interesting. That's a really good one. I think I've always felt quite guilty, even though maybe you don't enjoy the job, maybe you're not, maybe you've got another brilliant opportunity. It's funny, isn't it? Like, actually, you know, the conversation to have with your manager to resign, do you feel guilty in that moment? I think you often do, because you know it's creating a problem. You're like, oh, no, I'm leaving a gap. That's an interesting one. That's a really good take on it. I do like a when coaching question. The reason is I think when's help you to be really specific for yourself. So if you just say frequency, I feel guilty all the time, or I feel guilty occasionally, it's probably not specific enough to prompt action. When you get to here, you can start to then go, well, what does this mean for me? Actually, what this means is that letting someone down is that's sort of the big trigger for me in terms of guilt, or comparison is the kind of really big trigger. So what is the thing that is most likely to kind of cause you guilt? Because then you can figure, okay, well, what would I do differently? Don't feel motivated for a role. Yeah, you feel like you're going around in circles. Yeah, Grace, so interesting. Also, I think sharing these, you just realize how much everyone has in common. So already, you know, the sort of the sharing it, saying out loud makes us realize, you know, when I say, oh, I feel guilty when I get ill, I'm like, well, 4 or 5 people have already said something very similar. And I go, oh, okay, well, first of all, at least it's not just me. And that always feels better to kind of know you're not alone. And then secondly, you start to go, okay, well, now I can recognize that. What might I do? The other way to think about this, which is sometimes helpful, I really like the when question. But I was actually interviewing someone for the podcast for an episode on career change last night. And we were talking about should scripts. And I do think should scripts are useful. Generally, actually, in careers, but particularly when it comes to guilt and what might be getting in your way. So shoulds would sound like, oh, I feel like I should have remembered that it was my son's Christmas jumper day today. And you're like, well, sure, I do feel bad that I didn't remember that. But do you know what? I can probably give myself a break given everything else that's happened in the last 24 hours in my house. Or I should be working harder. I should be working longer. I should be spending more time with my kids. Like whatever the shoulds be, when you're ill, I feel like I should be working, even though you're not very well. So just watch out for should scripts or should stories that you're telling yourself. And I think sometimes just recognizing what the should sound like means that you can break them. You can go, well, rather than a should script, because whose is that should? Like, is it, where's that should come from? Has somebody else said that to you? Usually not. So if I think about one of my specific ones, let's say when I'm ill, I should be working right now, for example. That might be what I kind of is going through my brain. Should be working right now. Is anyone actually telling you that that's what should be happening? Usually not. It's what you're telling yourself, versus you might just want to kind of think about, if I was reframing that script into something more useful, what would that sound like? So if I was getting rid of that should script and replacing it with a new script, which would be something like, when I'm not well, the more I rest, the quicker I'll get better, which is also true. And objectively, we all know it's true, but it's sort of breaking that cycle of the kind of the unhelpful scripts, and maybe coming up with an alternative. When I am ill, I should be resting. Maybe there's a different should in there. I think there's something about should, though, that I don't love as a word, because should doesn't feel very ownable. It feels a bit like I should be doing it, but I actually don't really want to. I find it quite hard to connect with anything positive that has the word should in, which is why I'd rather sort of rewrite the script into something that I think is more positive and more likely to propel me forward. So kind of the scripts that we tell ourselves, yeah, you're right, Helen, I think should does feel a bit like an obligation. Like I should read that book. Oh, I should have listened to the podcast this week. I should have sent that email. You're just like, oh, you're not sort of making yourself feel optimistic, back to the kind of helpless versus helpful. I'm not sure shoulds are ever that helpful. There is some interesting research when you do look at guilt, if you are fascinated in it, to kind of dig a bit deeper. Some level of guilt can actually be quite motivating, but only if you use it in a useful way. So not with something like the ill example, but if you think, oh, I feel a bit guilty that I've not spent any time on my own learning, that guilt can actually make you think, okay, well, what am I going to do about it? So if you ever have that kind of guilt that can kind of help you to just go, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, what might it make me do? Like Lucy's saying, yeah, exercise guilt can be quite helpful. But I think just recognize those shoulds if you feel like they're getting in your way. So I thought we would take 3 common types of guilt and together try and think about what might we do differently? So to-do list guilt. So this is the I'm not doing enough, I'm not getting through enough work, I haven't done enough today. So you sort of finish your day, your kind of work day, feeling guilty. Just let me know in the little circle here, star on the screen, does this one feel familiar for you? Let me just get rid of the random stars 1 sec. There we go. Sorry if you were super quick there. So do you have to-do list guilt? Do you have that sense of, yeah, I never finish the day. I always finish the day feeling a bit kind of guilty, or I recognize maybe at the end of a week I feel a bit guilty. Helen's like, yeah, in every aspect of your life. Yeah, okay. This actually is obviously such a challenge that you can find specific articles and research just on this. So when I was looking around guilt, to-do list guilt actually is the one where people they actually write about like what to do if you've got to-do list guilt. I feel like Caroline just getting anxious like every bloody day. I like that. Your notes is full of your to-do list, feeling guilty for not finishing it. Yeah, always. Yeah, you're not working on a production line. Yeah. I think if this is you, I think we've got to rethink what does success look like? Because I think the problem here is we're going, right, here is my to-do list. Let's say, here's my to-do list for Thursday. And let's imagine, I wish there was only 5 things on it. Let's imagine there was 5 things on it on a good day. There's 5 things on that to-do list for today. Our starting point here with guilt is going, success equals ticking off every single one of those. So, and then because we tick off 2 of them equals, I feel guilty that I've not done enough. And so if our starting point is always, here is a to-do list to get through, we're never going to win. You know, like we are not setting ourselves up for success. We are actually setting ourselves up to fail. And so I think we've got to reframe what that to-do list is for, what success looks like. And so one of the things that I learned actually from a brilliant founder that I worked for, when I really felt like I was sort of failing on all fronts, and you know, you're feeling guilty, like nothing is going well. He just said to me, and I've always found this really useful, is what is the one thing you need to do really well today? The one thing. So rather than having a to-do list, I often do start a day with a kind of one list. I'm like, if I do one thing really, really well today, what does that need to be? And it really helps me find some focus. It also gives me a better chance of finishing a day, not feeling guilty, but feeling good. So here, I think we are trying to go, how can your to-do list not make you feel guilty, but make you feel good? And if you do the one, I guarantee it is a really, really different framing. And so, for example, on Friday, I was thinking, right, the one thing I need to do today is I've got to write a first version of a HBR article about a year in review, like a framework that we've come up with. And there was loads of other stuff I could do. And I was putting it off a little bit because I was like, it's hard. It's quite a hard thing to do. But I was so clear, and I was like, that is my one thing. And so that was always my starting point. So actually at the end of Friday, I was like, I've done it. I've done the one thing. Oh, brilliant, Heather, you've just written your one thing. Yeah, one non-negotiable thing every day. Yeah, really nice. So feels like you've already kind of cracked that mindset, that mentality. Brilliant. The other thing, if this is a real challenge for you, is also at the end of every day, write down one thing that you've done that you didn't expect to do. So this is not sort of writing something on your to-do list to just cross it out, which I know some people do. But this is actually just reflecting on your day and going, first of all, amazing. I did that one thing that I said I really needed to do. Oh, and do you know what? Actually, I also did, let's imagine, I helped that person with that presentation. It's not going to make it on any to-do list. We assume our to-do list is everything that is important for that day. And it's not, because new things come our way. We reprioritize as we go. Someone says, any chance you could help me with that presentation? You say, of course. And then actually, we should feel equally good that that happened. And so again, moving from guilt to good. If your to-do list is not making you feel good, I think we've got to rethink how we approach them. Or don't call it a to-do list. Call it a sort of it's actions across the week. Maybe if it was actions across the week, just framing it. I think to-do lists actually feel, for most of us, like today lists. And very, very rarely is it actually about today. So maybe actions across a week. You might need that because, I mean, I would still need that so I don't forget. So I'm like, well, I do need to come back to that. I do need to come back to that. But fundamentally, today is about dot. Lucy's saying she does it monthly. Great. So she's zoomed out even more than that. Yeah, Julia. Okay, interesting. So actually part-time has sort of forced you to get better at this. So I think we know our ambition here. I think people are recommending Oliver Burkeman's work on time. I think in particular, his book is very good. If you are really thinking time is what is causing guilt for me, read his book. You can listen to him on our podcast. Very rare that I say this. I think the book is better than the podcast. I do think he is at his best putting his thoughts down like in a book. 4,000 weeks. I think it's Time and How to Spend It, or How We Spend It, something like that. I think someone's already put it in the chat, but it's the one book where you're like, it is worth your time. I think it will help you just rewire how you think about time and your connection to guilt. So to-do list guilt, we've got to get rid of this, and we've just got to reframe, I think, how we think about it. Boundaries. Let me know using the stars. Who gets boundaries guilt? Oh, let me just get rid of the one sec. There you go. Boundaries guilt. Anyone? Anyone not get boundary guilt? I'd love to know if you don't ever get boundary guilt. We need to know your secrets. You need to share your secrets in chat if this is you. So boundary guilt. Amazing. Let us know. I think most of us are trying to work on boundaries, or it's something we're kind of always coming back to. I was trying to think this morning, what works to create boundaries? So I've got two. Lucy, good question. What does this mean? Guilt when you don't set boundaries. I would say it's when your boundaries become blurred, or the boundaries that you were hoping to have in place, kind of get messy. So let's say you're like, well, I'm going to finish work at 4 o'clock because then I don't know, I have an hour to myself to exercise. And actually what happens is you finish every day at 5 and you never do that exercise. So you kind of end up with boundary guilt. You're like, I want to be doing the exercise, but it's never actually happening. Or you want to be doing something with your kid, and then actually at the same time you're trying to do some work, and you're like, all my boundaries are just basically making me feel bad. Grace, you've had to work really hard at it. Great. What's helped? Let me know what's helped. I wrote down 2 things that have helped me with boundaries. Good to see that some of you are like, yeah, I don't have boundary guilt. You kind of get, you're like, it's important for me to have boundaries, but also you're all recognizing it's not been easy. So what has helped you? I got to 2 things that helped me with 2 specific boundaries. One of them actually surprised me when I thought about it. Yeah, as you've got older, you get better, still a work in progress. Claire, that's interesting. So feedback, whether it's from your children or from someone else, almost like people calling you out on stuff, that I think that can be really helpful. I sometimes do this a little bit, I think, with some people in our team who clearly found boundaries a bit harder, and they'll tell me about something, and then I'll see that they're not doing that, or it's not happening, and I sort of call it nice nudges. How nice it is, I'm never sure. But like, oh, I thought you said you were doing that. Or how come you're on email because you said that you're doing this thing tonight? Almost just sort of like nicely calling people on boundaries that they have said are important to them. But it's so easy to blur our boundaries. And I think when people find it hard, sort of a supportive nudge can actually be really useful. So yeah, Claire, I think feedback is really helpful. I did have people as one of mine. So I think other people can really help you with your boundaries. If you share them, I think other people really help you stick with them. That's a really nice one, Grace. I love that. I always think as values as a career compass. And often we talk about values in the context of choices and decision making. But actually, I really like you connecting the dots there between values, your motivators and drivers, and going, well, this is why my boundary matters. So if freedom, for example, is one of your values, is one of Helen's values, her number 1 value, in fact, if she has, if her boundaries get so blurred that they take away her freedom, that's going to be a disaster for her, because that's a really, really motivating part of who she is and what matters to her. So that's, I haven't made that connection, but I think that's genius. I think that's a really, really good insight there. Yeah, interesting, Susie. Big life events. I kind of know what you mean. Kind of happened to me this year as well. When something really big comes your way, makes you reassess maybe what's important and gives you a bit of perspective sometimes. Yeah, really nice, Maria. Put your own oxygen mask on first. This might just be me. One of the other ones I wrote down was money. So one of the things that helps me with boundaries is if I have paid for something, and this might just be because of my own attitude to money, with things like exercise and stuff, if I have paid for it or if I've committed to a person, then I really don't like the idea of wasting money. So I'm much more likely to stick to that boundary. If it was like going for a run, which is free, I'm way less likely to do it. If it's, but I've paid for this class, I was like, but I lose the money if I don't turn up. And obviously you're like, those things they're like, it's a sort of stupid small thing really, but it definitely helps me with boundaries. So I think it's just I don't like the loss aversion that comes with I've paid for something and then I'm not going to redeem that thing. So I don't know if that helps. Depends what your yeah, it probably is the sunk cost fallacy thing. And that loss aversion, space from somebody else. Yeah. Working out. Yeah, it is the sort of the cost per visit, those kind of things. And I do think just going, and I think we often don't do this. What are my 3 most important boundaries? Like, how many of us have actually kind of gone, my 3 most important boundaries are ... And if you're in a great team, a high trust team, could you share those boundaries with each other? And also when those boundaries change, also making sure you communicate those things. So these are my 3 boundaries in a week, or these are the 3, and they're often really small things, but the more we share them, the easier it is to stick to them. So I think that is personally, I think that's the place to start. Start with your values and see if that can kind of motivate you around boundaries and sticking to them versus blurred boundaries. So values, great place to start. Then you can get into the practical, people, price, priorities, etc. Anybody experience this one? Let's make it red. Feeling guilty because you have made a mistake, missed a deadline, kind of maybe, do you know what, not done what you said you're going to do. So, you know, kind of probably of the 3, the one where you probably most natural to feel guilty. You said you were going to do something and you didn't. There's a say-do gap. You made a mistake. You missed a deadline. I really don't like this one. This is what makes me feel most guilty, really. Quite linked to your to-do list. Interesting, Alicia. Yeah, like I don't find that. But I think for some people, I can see how they would be the same, because you'd be like, well, I said I was going to do these things on my to-do list and then I haven't. So I can see how they're connected. I think I'm very driven by, well, I said I was going to hit this deadline, and then not doing that will literally keep me awake at night. And probably because I'm deadline driven, like Heather's saying, then Alison's like, well, I'm trying to do a great job, and sometimes perfectionism, procrastinating can get in the way. Interesting. Yes, that's a really good insight, because it's the most rational. You're right. It's the most obvious reason for guilt. It's probably the most understandable reason for guilt, very rationally. I like the fact you're like, oh, I can fix it fast. Interesting. I like that. It's a good bit of self-awareness there. Feels like too many things in my head. Sometimes you can miss something. Accountability bit. Yeah, because you worry about your reputation. I like that. If you don't keep your promises, you wake up in a cold sweat. So yeah, I'm a bit like that. It sort of keep me awake at night, but then I don't get up and do the thing, because I'm like, it's sort of too late. So you then don't do anything about it. And I think the things with mistakes and deadlines is to go, what is the upside? There is usually some upside somewhere. You've missed the deadline because another priority came along. You've done something else well somewhere else. So think about what are the upsides, and then also know that it is okay to sort of apologize and go again. You know, sometimes it is just a bit like, we said we were going to do this, we've not. Okay, well, how do we go again at it? What can we learn? You know, the kind of when I fail, I never fail to learn. I think that is the point here. We are all human. We are all imperfect. The most important thing from this, I think, is, what did you learn? How can you be a bit better next time? How can you make sure you don't repeat the same mistake? How can you shorten your say-do gap, but also knowing that there will always be a gap, because none of us get this right all of the time. So trying to not be too hard on ourselves, trying to give ourselves that a little bit of forgiveness along the way. I think if you write down what you've learned, it helps you to let go. That's the thing for me. That's one of the things that I was taught. I remember a brilliant CEO saying to me, she was like, if you write down what you've learned, it's much easier to let go, and then you're just better because of it. And I sort of have that mantra in my mind, because this is the one that I've spent a bit of time thinking about, and trying not to feel guilty about, not beat myself up, because actually it's wasted energy. And I go, what I want to do is apply that energy in a more useful and helpful way. So I hope that hasn't felt too on a Thursday morning. Usually we're all like really upbeat. I think what's really reassuring is people have had brilliant ideas today. I feel better about managing guilt because we have spent time together talking about it. So I hope you all feel optimistic and that we can see guilt as something to be proactive about, to not just be a low-lying frustration, and particularly this time of year to give ourselves a bit of a break. We do have one more PodPlus next week. We will send a note about what's happening. I believe it's going to feel festive. Helen is very much in charge of it, and I will probably be leaving her to it. And I will leave that intriguing note with you all about what the plan is for next week. So keep your eye out for your emails, get those Christmas jumpers ready, and maybe see it as a good opportunity to do something a little bit different just before Christmas. Thank you so much, everyone. See you all soon.